and welcome to World Insight with me, Tianwei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing, and happy Chinese New Year. U.S. President Donald Trump delivered his second State of the Union address on Tuesday. In his speech, he flaunted the job figures, announced a meeting with DPRK's leader Kim Jong later this month, and called on Congress to choose greatness over gridlock. Of course, the annual address was delayed due to the longest federal shutdown in U.S. history. Before we get down to a talk with our panelists from China and the U.S., let's take a look at this.
The President of the United States!
Millions of our fellow citizens are watching us now gathered in this great chamber, hoping that we will govern not as two parties, but as one nation.
Bipartisan cooperation is not a new theme in the U.S. President's annual speech. But this year, the call is particularly fitting as the State of the Union address was delayed due to the longest federal shutdown in U.S. history. For Holocaust survivors and children who battle cancer, there is unanimous support. But on contentious issues such as immigration and abortion, the divide cannot be more literal, as conservatives cheered and clapped on one side, while liberals remained still. With a pushback from some Republicans, the U.S. President did not use the occasion to declare a national emergency to fund the border wall, as some had speculated. However, Mr. Trump's battle with the Democrats is far from over, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's expressions speak volumes about their fraught relationship. The address started with claims of a U.S. economic miracle under his presidency. Indeed, unemployment is at a historic low, and the latest GDP growth figure is encouraging. But some say the trade disputes with China will negatively impact the U.S. and global economy. In his address, Mr. Trump confirmed a second meeting with the DPRK leader Kim Jong. The two will meet in Vietnam for 2 days at the end of the month. Among the 102 women serving in Congress, 89 of them are Democrats and 13 are Republicans. The Democrats picked Stacey Abrams to deliver the rebuttal to Trump's State of the Union address, a historic first for an African-American woman.
The shutdown was a stunt, engineered by the President of the United States, one that defied every tenet of fairness and abandoned not just our people, but our values.
Women are also prominent among 2020 presidential challengers to Mr. Trump. Judging from their reactions, they seem bent on getting the job done themselves.
For more on Trump's State of the Union address and many of the points he mentioned during the address, I'm joined in Beijing by Mr. Gao Zhikai, who is our current affairs commentator, and also Joe Rubin, who is the president of the Washington Strategy Group, also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Welcome to both of you to our special program today. Happy New Year to both of you. Thank you. Let me ask you first, Mr. Rubin, is this a State of the Union address, or this is a preview of a presidential campaign address?
Well, it's wonderful to be here with you, and it was a hybrid, really. President Trump attempted to integrate a State of the Union set of principles and the typical way that a president addresses Congress about his vision for the work with his 2020 campaign pivot. But you could feel the language and some of the more clarifying attack lines related to, for example, fusing socialism in Venezuela with essentially the Democratic Party, issues of immigration and choice as well. So he is laying out a sort of layering of language that he will use over the next couple of years to take into the presidential campaign, most definitely.
Mr. Gao, though, we understand that Mr. Trump has a very unique way of speaking, and this time he's reading from the script. Of course, there's quite a cutaway from his usual style. Can we expect the year to come will be very different, or there's likely to be a coming back to his style?
I think this is a very typical speech by President Donald Trump. It's a very important speech. It will be one of the most important speeches of his political career. However, at the same time, it's very controversial. It's very partisan. It's very divisive. And I think it will really anger the Democrats very much, and the partisan fight among the Republicans and the Democrats probably will be further steepened in the weeks and months ahead.
Well, some of the points mentioned here needs to be further discussed, particularly from China's perspective. Mr. Rubin, particularly regarding China-U.S. trade talks, the president was talking about some of the principles for the purpose of this trade talk. He talked about cutting the deficit, talk about creating American jobs, talking also about so-called structural changes. How do you see these three purposes being mentioned by the president, and how are recent discussions between the two sides related to these principles he is trying to illustrate, at least from the U.S. perspective?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and thinking about it from a policy perspective, first and foremost, the president doesn't have to really argue too much about the challenge of China and trade with the American people. Both parties, and this goes back multiple years, both parties have concerns about the trade relationship. But where the departure is, and this gets into the political realm, is that his measures, a trade war, for example, these high tariffs, they're having a real impact on American workers, American farms. They are costing Americans more for the products, and it's not clear that they're going to be effective, and it's harming relations with China when we have multiple issues that we have to deal with. And so the politics from a Democratic perspective are interesting, because President Trump didn't talk about the impact of this trade war on the American people, nor did he talk about, frankly, the shutdown and its impact either. He glossed over that, but that's real, and Democrats are going to talk about that and run on that. And I think it's also worth mentioning there's a deep suspicion here of the president's capacity to negotiate. And while he says that he has a good relationship with President Xi, and that's valuable, many people in Washington are concerned that he will actually come out with a bad deal with China, end the trade war, and not advance some of the concerns from a policy perspective that are real and that are bipartisan.
What is the interpretation of a bad deal? Of course, to different sides, it means different things. But there's one thing that Mr. Trump said, and here we quote, "We recently imposed tariffs on 250 billion of Chinese goods, and now our Treasury is receiving billions of dollars." That's what he said. But according to the U.S. Census Bureau, China's goods trade deficit with the United States swelled through the decades from $6 million 1985 to $344 billion 2018, and it's larger than the next 9 U.S. goods trade deficits combined. But having said that, though, Mr. Gao, what is the way, from the Chinese perspective, to handle the trade issue? Will the three purposes, so-called, by President Trump today at the State of the Union address really likely to address the problem?
Well, first of all, I think President Donald Trump in his State of the Union speech still completely misguided himself or the United States or the rest of the world about the value of tariffs. Tariffs are bad things for China as well as for the United States. It actually diminishes the trade between China and the United States, as well as it makes American farmers and manufacturers and consumers suffer. So I hope President Donald Trump, first of all, will realize that tariffs don't work, and tariffs are bad for the United States as well as for China. Now, there are indeed very serious problems in China-U.S. trade and economic relations that need to be resolved, but tariffs are not the best solution for that. I think China and the United States do need to sit down and enter into earnest discussions about how to better solve these problems for the mutual benefit rather than for the mutual detriment.
Well, very interesting. We need to have our two guests on this very important topic, because China's trade with the United States, or the other way around, has to be considered in the bigger picture of what exactly is the U.S. approach to international trade. That was also mentioned, Mr. Rubin, in the State of the Union address by President Trump. USMCA, for example, WTO, for example. So how can you outline what is he specifically looking at when it comes to solutions about trade?
Well, we have to remember that Donald Trump not only has been a skeptic about trade as a president, but he has been for years critical of trade. And when he ran in 2015, 2016, the distinguishing factor between him and other Republican candidates was his hostility to trade. And his description, for example, of NAFTA, despite the tremendous gains in productivity, in reduction of prices, in employment over the last 25 years, caused by NAFTA. It doesn't mean it's perfect, but it has had major gains. Despite that, he calls it a disaster, and he renegotiated a trade deal with Mexico that essentially is just NAFTA with a little bit more. So the president is hostile to trade. He doesn't have a clear vision, though, on how to actually achieve gains that are going to protect intellectual property, reduce the trade deficit, and do so without blowing everything up. And I agree with our guest here in Beijing that a trade war is a last resort, and this president seems to be using it as a first resort, and that's the problem, and that makes it a negotiation where we get real, tangible benefits for both countries. That makes it much harder.
And another thing we see, Mr. Gao, is the President Trump talking about reciprocal act. That's when others put on tariffs on the U.S. goods, the U.S. would be able to do the same on that specific party. And he called on the Congress. Of course, now it's a very divided Congress with the two parties at different sides. So he called on the Congress to approve that. How much do you see the chance of the Congress right now to do that? And what does that mean for the other trading partners of the United States?
First of all, I think it's highly unlikely that the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives will go along with what President Donald Trump would propose in this reciprocity point. However, on the other hand, I think in China-U.S. trade, at least, what President Donald Trump has talked about so often about reciprocity can actually be incorporated. I personally have made a proposal called a reciprocal zero tariff. It is being looked at. Whether it will be adopted at all is questionable. Therefore, I think in China-U.S. trade, we need to look at all the other possible solutions.
Like what?
So long as, for example, there will be more trade rather than less trade, and the United States can sell more goods to China. The Chinese leaders have mentioned repeatedly in recent period of time that the Chinese market and the demand of the Chinese consumers will be so big that they can really accommodate many things manufactured and exported by the United States. We hope this will happen.
That's the Chinese argument, isn't it, Mr. Rubin?
Yeah, it is. And look, we can't avoid China, putting on a very American perspective here. We can't avoid China in the global marketplace, and we need to figure out how to get the rules of the road right. The problem right now with this approach, and it's a general problem with the Trump administration, is that it's a sort of a bilateral, go it alone, America first or America only approach. And we need to engage regionally, we need to engage in multilateral fora, and we need to engage in the trade dialogue that is inclusive, not one that's pushing China away. And I think that's why it will be very hard for the president to sell any trade agreements on Capitol Hill, because there's a deep skepticism about how he's going about doing this.
Oh, very interesting there. Of course, whether Mr. Rubin's point of view is very representative of both parties. That, of course, we'll only have the time to test. But Mr. Gao, let me ask you that as well. Infrastructure, that was also mentioned. I remember China also has been talking about infrastructure building all over the world, whether it is internet infrastructure or hardware infrastructure. So, Mr. Gao, how do you see what is being mentioned in the State of the Union address, that the U.S. is determined to build its infrastructure?
Well, first of all, it's the right thing to say, to build up infrastructure in the United States. I travel extensively throughout the United States, and in many parts of the country, infrastructure projects are really outdated. They need to be really updated. That's number one. However, how do you get the money, and how do you get the expertise to really build up the infrastructure? In all honesty and in all fairness, China is probably the country which has built the best infrastructure and the largest amount of infrastructure projects over the past 2 decades.
With the so-called strategic competition that some of the Americans strategists already think about when it comes to China, is it possible? I mean, is it pragmatic?
That's why I think the American leaders, the Congress, the government really need to think hard about what exactly can better generate for the benefits of the American people and serve the American interests. Because I think China is a force to be utilized, and China can become a partner to the United States rather than being belittled or being sidelined as a force of evil, for example. China is a friendly force to the United States.
Has the dust settled down when it comes to what exactly is the nature going to be U.S.-China relations in Washington? Mr. Rubin, your sense?
Well, I think that we're still in a very rocky period, and that's because this trade war, this dynamic is not going to dissipate. There are questions about China's role in national security issues in the South China Sea. It hovers just under the surface related to Taiwan. And we don't have a comprehensive China policy right now. We're sort of in a drift and in a piecemeal arrangement. And with the Democratic House, what we're likely to see for the next year or so are hearings, even though the president last night tried to tell the Congress that it should ignore its constitutional duty and not conduct oversight of the executive branch. It won't listen to that. And there will be significant hearings, and those will be very difficult for Chinese ears to hear, because you will see a lot of criticism of President Trump. But under the surface, everyone understands we need to get this relationship right. There's just a lot of concern right now about how it's being executed.
Well, the different concerns of different nature, I guess, from different sides. Another issue, of course, is about the political gridlock. Mr. Rubin, also your expertise here about the wall. Of course, President Trump today used different adjectives: translucent, see-through walls. These are very interesting adjectives that calls on a lot of imagination from both parties as to what kind of wall is this going to be, how long it will be like, and what is likely to be built over there on the border, and will that appeal sitting on the fences, as they say, literally this time? Mr. Rubin.
Well, the president could have called for a cellophane wall that no one would be able to see, and Democrats would still oppose it. At this stage, Democrats have zero appetite for any wall, and you could feel the president trying any angle he could to speak past the Democrats and get the American people on board with this idea. But it's not popular. He's losing in the polls on it. His framing about the need for a wall as something to block people from Mexico coming in is perceived by Democrats and the majority of the country as very hostile to our southern neighbors, and the net result is that Democrats aren't going to support it. He won't have the votes. He's going to have to look for other ways to do it, and Republicans in the Senate are very concerned about him declaring a national emergency for many legitimate reasons, including their fear that a president will do that in the future, maybe on gun control or climate change.
Of course.
So he's in a box, he knows it, and he's trying to keep his base together, but they're not happy with his performance either.
And quickly, some other points, also strategically extremely important. Mr. Gao, we heard President Trump talking about the second Kim-Trump summit, the end of February, 27th, 28th, in Vietnam. China, important party, six-party talk. What is expected?
Well, the meeting is going to be a very important meeting. However, whether the meeting will generate into a result of denuclearization is highly questionable. And I think President Donald Trump probably has put into so much of optimism into the meeting that eventually there will be a letdown. China definitely will do whatever it can to facilitate the meeting taking place. And also China has already invited President Donald Trump to make a trip to Hainan Island in China to meet with the Chinese president.
Right,
Xi
he's
Jinping,
talking about that
either
too.
before or after the meeting in Vietnam.
That's right. We'll see what's going to likely to come because right before the 90-day deadline, as they say. Mr. Rubin, also your thoughts here, briefly?
Yeah, thank you. The intelligence community last week assessed that North Korea is not planning to give up its nuclear weapons. President Trump is walking into a situation where he will have a second summit potentially without that, and that's a dangerous spot. And President, the cynicism is high. He wants something so much, but he doesn't have a plan for how to get a deal with North Korea that actually secures a denuclearization process, and that's the big concern here. No one wants war with North Korea. He pointed out yesterday he prevented a war by being elected. That's unprovable and unlikely. But what we want is a real legitimate process that we can all have confidence in, including our intelligence community.
Right. Joe Rubin, Gao Zhikai, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us on the New Year's Day, Chinese New Year, for us to analyze the State of the Union address. Thank you so much. Have a great year. Stay with us here on World Inside with me, Tian Wei, still to come on the program.